I'm really excited to be here with you and honored. I wanted to have a little bit of fun with this presentation. So there's a lot of things about humility that are kind of paradoxical. So it seemed appropriate to have an award ceremony, and I wanted to kind of model this similar to the Emmy Awards, except we would call it the Humby Awards. So y'all just bear with me, but I think this will be kind of a fun way for me to share some of the work that we've been doing over the past 10 or 15 years on humility. Um, so I wanted to start just by thanking Pete Hill. So how I came to this work, I was in Everett Worthington's lab, and Jen Hunter was doing a project on humility, and she ended up going into a different career track. And so we had an abandoned project, and I thought it was fascinating. I kind of got on board when people were concerned that we might never really even be able to measure humility, much less think about like a science of helping people grow in humility. So I'll kind of start with the phase of work that was trying to address that problem. And you'll kind of see things may have gotten worse before they got better. But basically, I'll kind of talk about that phase. Then there was a second phase where we were basically looking for ways that humility might matter in real life, where are the most important places that humility might help. And then in this last phase that we're currently working on, we're trying to promote interventions that would help people grow in intellectual humility. So that's kind of the structure of the talk. June Tagney kind of had one of the early definitions. So I thought I would kind of give you a sense of some of the kind of conversations that were swirling. So she wrote an early theory paper and was kind of trying to synthesize work in theology, philosophy, some work in psychology, trying to kind of begin to think about what humility might be. And you'll see a lot of these components kind of continue to rattle around in conceptualizations, a sense of an accurate view of strengths and weaknesses, open to new ideas, keeping your accomplishments in proper perspective, a low self-focus, and then something possibly about appreciating the value of all things. So I wanted to kind of give a quote from C.S. Lewis that many of you may have read before. I feel like some of these Christian writings may have had a heavy influence on some of the initial ideas about approaching humility in terms of scientific study. And so many of you probably read this quote before or read this book. But C.S. Lewis basically says that there's a paradox with humility where the more you think of yourself as being in good shape, it actually might be a bad sign. So this intuition, right or wrong, had a really heavy weight on kind of discouraging some of the initial work on humility, because people were thinking, we need to really, really get this right in terms of measurement. We're not wanting to measure just modesty or someone acting humble. We want a true kind of humility that goes deeper and has a sense of integrity. I actually had this picture in my dissertation, and this kind of illustrates what people thought the problem was. So you could have a problem where someone who's a narcissist might overestimate their humility, and someone who was truly humble might underestimate their humility, where when you're measuring self-reports of humility, everyone would essentially be saying something similar. So this idea is that maybe it's just impossible to measure humility accurately. So this is kind of where the field started. So I kind of gave y'all an overview. I wanted to prime a couple of things for you just to kind of get intuitions going about your ideas of humility. And so I had a couple of activities I thought you could kind of just do in your own mind. So when I give out these Humvees, I wanted to kind of point out, the green is a participation badge. The smaller the trophy, the better. So this is the holy grail of measures. And then a Humvee, that's really good. So I just want to give y'all some sense of what these awards would end up being. So I wanted to give you one story that kind of illustrates what can be challenging about studying humility, just to kind of prime the mental pump. So when I came to Ev's lab, we did work on forgiveness, and it seemed like one of the challenges in terms of interventions of forgiveness was that people were worried about, well, what if people forgive when it's not good for them and it could be harmful? I think there's probably similar kinds of concerns with humility as well, and I wanted to give you an example of a story in my life where humility kind of ran into some of these problems. So Josh Hook and I were in Ev's lab, and we went through grad school together. And at one point, we were helping a friend move, and he was giving stuff away. And so at one point, he was giving away a TV, and Josh was like, "Okay, yeah, I'll take the TV." And then next, there was a set of golf clubs, pretty, not very valuable golf clubs, but golf clubs nonetheless. And we were poor grad students. And so the question was, we both wanted the golf clubs. Who should get them? Well, Josh was a budding couples therapist. And so he had an intervention that he was pretty excited about called State It or Rate It. And so basically what he would do with couples is that he would have the couple state what they wanted and then give a number of how much they wanted it. And based on State or Rate It, both people would do this. And then, ideally, the person who wants it the most gets what they want. So we agreed that we were going to follow the rules of State It and Rate It. And so, I obviously, as a humble guy, I said, "Josh, why don't you go first?" So Josh goes and he says, "Well, I want the golf clubs, and I want, I mean, it'd be nice not to have to pay for them. I could pay for my own golf clubs, but I give it a 6." And so I thought to myself, okay, well, I want it too. And I kind of want the golf clubs, and I kind of want not to have to pay for it too. So I rated a 7. And, Josh, being a man of his word, followed the rules, and he gave me the golf clubs. So this is an illustration, I think, of what people worry about with humility. So in this case, I think Josh was the more humble person relationally. And I ended up getting what I wanted, and I got the golf clubs. So how do we deal with this kind of problem where humility might be something that we want other people to have? How is it that we would kind of come to a way of promoting this that wouldn't lead to this kind of, so Josh and I are good friends, and we were able to repair the results of this. We didn't have many fights, and this was one of our first ones over our first 5 years as good friends together. But this requires some repair because I did something selfish. I followed the rules of the game, but I actually took what I wanted and took advantage of his good faith attempt to have cooperation. So that's an illustration of what I think is kind of a challenge of humility in real life. The second thing I wanted to have you think about was, what if part of how humility works is that we get to take some of the most important people in our lives, and there's a part of the way that they live their lives that we can internalize, and we can almost bring them with us into new situations. And part of how that works is if I encounter a situation and I say, well, how would my dad, or how would Ev Worthington, or how would my partner Carlene, how would she handle the situation? And if they have different kinds of humility skills than I have, I might be able to borrow on a mindset from them and bring that into how I interact in a situation. So one of the first books that I read when I was kind of trying to figure out what to do with Jen Hunter's projects was Ev's book, Humility, the Quiet Virtue. And at one point, he's grappling with these issues of measurement and paradoxes, but he suggests that we can have a hall of fame of humility in our hearts to nominate people who have done works of selfless service and caring about the good of the community. And they really rise to our highest aspirations of what it would mean to be a good person. And so that's kind of always stuck with me. And so I wanted to just have you think, like, if there really was such a thing as a humility hall of fame, and if it really did work that way, where each person gets to kind of fill the halls with a few people that you decide to admire in your own life and kind of bring with you into the kind of person that you would want to be, who would go on that list? And if you're, I'm okay if you pick. I think it's good to pick real people, but it's also okay to kind of pick some people that you've just heard about, and it just sounds like they're embodying kind of the highest qualities. So I think these two aspects. So one is our fears about humility, and then the other is what are our highest aspirations. I think that kind of gets at why humility scholars were really, really being perfectionistic about wanting to measure this well, because there is a higher part to it. There is a part that we want to be very good. So I called this first page this first phase, the toothpaste, the toothbrush phase. And at one point there was someone who wrote a paper and basically said, measures are kind of like toothbrushes. Everyone kind of wants their own. Well, that did happen in the study of humility. So people have not enjoyed brushing their teeth with other people's toothbrushes. And so I wanted to give participation awards. And then we can see if anyone gets the holy grail of measuring humility perfectly. Spoiler alert, there's a couple of papers. Stacy McElroy and Tennille Porter have written papers kind of critiquing the state of the field and why do we need 35 to 40 measures of humility. This picture is the wild, wild west and kind of herding cats. So this is kind of a possible analogy of where the humility field is. And so I guess a question I would invite you to is, what's going on with this? Is it just that humility scholars are kind of all over the place, or is there something about humility that is kind of like a toothbrush? Everyone wants their own. Maybe there's something very personal about humility, and maybe we each need our own toothbrush. One of the early, I'll give a few awards just in intellectual humility. So Stacy McElroy published the first measure, so she got to call it the intellectual humility scale, and it's building off kind of the idea that we may not be good at judging our own humility, but we can judge the humility of other people pretty quickly. And so just to give you a sense of some of the items that she had, if you are described by your partner as acting like a know-it-all on a regular basis, you might not be very humble. If you become angry when you don't take your partner's advice or an interlocutor, you might not be humble. On the other hand, if you're open to competing ideas, if you're good at mediating controversial topics, if you're good at considering the limitations of your perspective, you might be considered humble by your close loved ones. So Rick Hoyle gets a participation award. So they published the shortest measure of intellectual humility. And it's been very highly cited. And one thing that's nice about short measures is it's easy to put them in studies, even large kind of panel studies. So just to give you a sense of some of the items, I question my own opinions, positions, and viewpoints because they could be wrong. I recognize the value in opinions that are different from my own. So this is, one approach to kind of self-reported intellectual humility. Liz Krumrei gets an award. So her measure, I think she called it the comprehensive intellectual humility scale. I think she did the best job of kind of integrating a wide range of experts into drawing items for a measure of intellectual humility. And so she ended up with 4 different factors. And by the way, if anybody wants some, I kind of have a lot of slides, and I have notes on my slides, so I'm happy to send those out. I'll probably just put them on a Substack page, and y'all can kind of download these later if you happen to want them. But just to get a sense of how some of these items are somewhat similar and different from others. Wade Rowett worked with a team of philosophers, and so one of the cool things about interdisciplinary work is if we involve theologians and philosophers in the process of defining the construct and developing items, then that's actually kind of a very pragmatic way to try to increase alignment across disciplines. And so the measure he created was actually integrating philosophers into his team of people that were going to create items. So that gets an award. Josh Hook, and I think I gave Brad awards. So they kind of helped by not contributing to the toothbrush problem. So they already had measures of humility in business, or Josh had a measure of cultural humility. I was on this paper. Instead of creating a new measure of intellectual humility, He just adapted his measure of cultural humility to studying, so cultural humility. So he tailored it to religion. How humble are you towards your religious beliefs? And so we didn't need a new measure. We just used his measure. Brad, I'll talk a little bit more about his work. He has a really, really strong program of research in business that has ended up being integrated into training at West Point. Over 120 papers in a recent review. So this has had a lot of influence on the business field. So one of his subscales was somewhat aligned with intellectual humility. So he's tended to just use his measure. So it both fits the spirit of the toothbrush, and he didn't add to the pile of measures. So that was good. So just a few thoughts, and I'll kind of circle back to some of these things at the end. And also, I'm hoping we can have some discussion as well. But what's going on with humility scholars all kind of wanting their own measure? Is it pure egotism? I mean, are we just all kind of trying to do the publication game, and we all just want the high honors and high pay of doing humility scholarship, or is there something else going on here? Um, it could just be the first one, but I think it might. I think there might be more going on here. So Tennille gets an award. So she wrote actually several really good papers critiquing kind of what's going to happen if we don't start to come to more agreement. And in kind of psychology world, they talk about jingle jangle problems. So this is basically, what if we're all measuring different things and calling them the same thing? Or what if we have all of these things that are really the same thing, but we just created a bunch of different measures? We might want to work towards synthesis somehow, because that would be a problem. But she gets an award because I saw at one point she did create her own scale. So everyone's taking a crack at this thing. Aranda was also on some of these papers critiquing the multiplication of measures. Aranda also added a measure to the mix. So everyone's taking a crack at this. The contribution of his measure is right now it's one of the only state measures, so it can be used in experience sampling approaches. And so most of the other measures are self-reported intellectual humility. How humble am I overall as a person? So his really did kind of go to a blue sea area, an area of measurement that wasn't being tapped. So at one point we did a special issue. How can we start to move towards synthesis? Brad had an interesting suggestion. So in the business world, one of the things you do at some point is you just say what makes a difference in terms of predicting important outcomes, and you start to cull the potential measures by looking at criterion-related validity. So this is one proposal. There's lots of ways you could potentially try to determine a winner. But at this point, I'm kind of arguing I don't know that I think it's been bad that there have been attempts by different scholars to try to get at kind of a high ideal of humility. And I'll give you a few kind of conceptual reasons why I think this might be okay. And I think it's okay for science to kind of work its process. And we'll know that there's a synthesis when scholars and other people who are making use of this knowledge trust that there's been a synthesis. So to me, one of the conclusions is I'm not sure that we're totally happy with where we are, and I'm not sure we think that we've fully solved the measurement problems. But I was going to say, so there's a scholar who has a preprint, Costello, where he did start to do some of this kind of criterion validity study. And bottom line is some of the measures we have aren't predicting behaviors that we would want things to predict. So if we do run the criterion validity test, there are probably problems. So just a couple of quick thoughts on what I think might be going on. So if you think about an individual instance of someone who has offended your sense of kind of an epistemic value, so they've shown themselves to be epistemically arrogant, they've offended you, and you've severely lost trust for them. what's happening in this process? I think one of the challenges is that, like, let's imagine that you're at a church that has more conservative values, and when let's say you're talking about something like evolution or sexual ethics, as we start to situate what the conflict is about, I need to know more information about how this person's humility is going to be judged, because they're going to act in a way that's consistent with the cultural values that they aspire to. But if I have different cultural values, then I may perceive them as being arrogant, even though they perceive themselves as acting with a type of intellectual humility. So I think this problem that values can moderate how behaviors are sometimes seen as more or less arrogant, depending on the values of the perceiver. I personally think that that problem is something that social scientists can't fully resolve. I think it might be a disciplinary limit, because I think at some point, to make the judgment that someone is acting with humility, I think we're inferring a type of moral goodness. And when we make that inference, it's happening in somebody's mind. And so part of what I think, there's just a boundary issue of whose mind got to decide whether it was good. Is God deciding? Well, we don't have a way to measure God's view of a person. Are we taking the researcher's view? The researcher is not God. So the researcher can take a view, but they basically moved from, and so I've been kind of reading debates of, can you separate your values from the process of science? And I think what I'm coming to is, I think they're fully integrated. I think the process of interpreting our data requires us to do moral things. I think we're basically making moral decisions about what is good. And I think a scientist is not able to kind of step away from that. And so we're kind of embedded in a process. So I kind of tried to draw a picture of how this might look. So above is the behaviors of a person, what we can see. I think underneath that is what's happening inside of a person and what's happening in someone's soul. And I think the bottom line is, I think psychology has a limit of what we can know about whether a person is good. I think we can basically make inferences above the surface based on behavior. But I think, just like anybody else, we're somewhat limited in what we can know about whether someone is truly a good person. So that leads me to conclude that I don't think we've solved, I don't think anyone solved the holy grail of humility measures. So a bridge to applied work. So the next phase is studying where humility might matter in real life. So Josh Hook, I'm giving him a humble B. So he has a line of work relating cultural humility to psychotherapy. The top paper on cultural humility didn't measure humility. So Josh created one of, I think, the first measure of cultural humility. So the theoretical paper has been cited 5,000 times. Josh's paper has been cited currently 18,000 times. So this has made a huge difference in kind of people viewing humility as relevant to our work as mental health professionals. Shauna Bose has a line of work on relating humility to conspiracy theories. This seems potentially relevant. There's a lot of attacks on kind of people's trust in knowledge sources. I mentioned earlier, Brad has a line of work on humility in leaders. What's really exceptional about some of Brad's work is he started with over 100 CEOs, and he did a grounded theory qualitative study to actually get the language and ideas of leaders applying this in their context. And then he developed a measure that aligns with that contextualization to leadership. I also wanted to give some humility humbug awards. So these are awards of people critiquing humility, like maybe it's not all that good. Daryl has a series of papers where he shows that it's not good if gender differences give people different credit for humility. So if I basically, am humble by helping out a little bit with childcare, and I get all this praise and affirmation, and my partner's like, hey, I used to be doing way more than that, and I didn't get a similar kind of credit. Maybe that's a disadvantage. Maybe something's going wrong there. Daryl documented this very clearly in a series of studies. Stacey Floyd Thomas wrote a paper making a similar kind of critique related to racial humility, and that there may be power dynamics happening in the process of how humility is thought of. And Sarah Moon and Steve Sandage wrote a similar paper where they basically took all of the really cool work on cultural humility and they said, but what if you're in systems that basically put pressure on clinicians of color to live up to the values of humility in the system? But there's actually, it's almost like the golf club problem that I mentioned earlier. There's an undercurrent of a power dynamic that's not fairly working. And so you're actually putting a burden on people to express humility without there being good reason to trust that the broader system is safe. So that gets an award. And then Sally Lee has a paper that's just about to be published where we took all of the work linking humility to different outcomes, things like health, mental health, relationships. And what we found was disappointing. I've had this happen at a number of points in my career. So what would have been good is if we found that basically the more humble you are, the happier you are, the better your relationships are, the better your health is. So like 0.8 correlation. Unfortunately, the effect sizes were pretty small. I'm happy to send anyone the paper, but they were very small. And so what it points to is if you're humble, but those people around you are not humble, it may not be good for you. It might still be good to do it, but it might not be good for you in kind of a, what's in it for me kind of perspective. So this is disappointing for my marketing team. Because many positive psychology constructs, we kind of get ready and say, this is good for your health. It's good for your relationships. It's good for everything. There's a little bit of bad news. This might have some negative consequences if you put the interest of others ahead of your own interest and they don't reciprocate. This could cause you some disadvantage in that relationship. And I also wanted to give a book award. So there's amazing books. I think we should have a book club. I'll kind of give a few shout outs. Good to Great, amazing book. Kind of there's a kind of paradox where people who are very, very driven and have high humility, they seem to be some of the strongest leaders. Daryl has a great book. My favorite book on humility applied to intellectual humility is Jonathan Rauch's Constitution of Knowledge. And he's basically getting at what are our rules of engaging each other that keep us from, even if we disagree, of us honoring each other and having a commitment to kind of correcting our errors. So I'll kind of, I put Tom Holland's Dominion on here. You could make a case that Matthew was a pretty good book on humility. So Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount talks about who is well off. And you could say that the Sermon on the Mount is a pretty powerful idea of saying that people who are well off are not the ones who use power to get their own advantage. But anyway, but I wanted to give, I think this is a series on flourishing in religious leaders. So I wanted to commend Steve Sandage has a book on relational spirituality. I think if you wanted a broader vision of kind of what we know about people developing a type of maturity as people and as leaders, I can't think of a better book than Steve Sandage's book on relational spirituality. So that gets the Humvee Award for the Book of the Year. And I kind of pulled one of his slides. So he really goes into different ways that you can have a type of grandiosity or a type of arrogance. And he gives different expressions as well as different ways of potentially correcting those types of arrogance. So part 3, in certain ways, things don't seem to be going perfectly. And I would say we still have a daunting challenge ahead of us of how are we going to promote these things in each other and in others if we don't agree totally on what they are and if it could lead to power struggles related to, kind of protecting people's interest and not having humility lead to disadvantages. So it could be that in a year from now, we'll end up doing something more like the Darwin Award. So these were kind of awards of people doing things that weren't very adaptive. And it might be that trying to build a humility intervention is kind of like trying to build a house on the edge of a cliff. Maybe the foundations aren't there. I don't know if y'all seen some of those shows where it seems like people can build a house pretty much anywhere they want. And that's kind of the approach we took with humility is we're not going to really know how to do this unless we try. So let's see what our problems are. But it could be that this is the kind of problem we have. So there are some modest attempts. So one idea is maybe we don't need to go the whole way and develop a full-fledged kind of clinical trial, full intervention. Maybe we need to just focus on how might it work? How do these things work? And so the metaphor would be, what's the theory of like, if I tip one domino, everything else would kind of follow? And so there's a YouTube video, if you want to see it, there's like 15 minutes of dominoes falling. Maybe there's a way to tip a domino and have everything else follow. What would that potentially be? So an example is, maybe we're already doing some humility. Stacy McElroy is doing a project saying, well, cognitive therapy is pretty powerful right now. The underlying virtue of cognitive therapy is we have irrational or maladaptive thoughts. So maybe we've already done some of this work. There's the most popular approaches right now are third wave cognitive therapy. So it's basically not just trying to change your thoughts because we have limitations in how much we can change our thoughts. Maybe we need to change how we even relate to our thoughts. And so if you look at therapies like ACT, what they're basically saying is you need a new way of even relating to your thoughts because you have much less control over your thoughts than you think you do. So that's one approach. I kind of sampled some of the different ways that some of the projects in our current RFP. So we have 17 different projects, and I'm not going to go over all of them. But admitting we're wrong, listening, drawing on values, drawing on metacognitive habits, drawing on kind of an integrated approach of motivation, ability, and practice. So if y'all go to our website, you can kind of get more of a description of some of these different attempts that are kind of up for the Darwin Awards next year. And I'm going to kind of pass by these. And then we have some people that are just going to go after building on the side of a cliff. So, and a lot of them are basically trying to contextualize humility to situations that make it really, really difficult to practice humility. Some of these have gotten harder since we even proposed the project. So spiritual struggles, when you're really kind of reconstructing your understanding of how the world works and your relationship with God, or kind of existential questions. Science communication, kind of after COVID-19 and after the pandemic. Multicultural training of clinicians, diversity-related issues at the university. And in Georgia, they've kind of asked us to say different words of, kind of focusing on diversity. So this is highly contested right now. Political polarization. And then there's one project that's kind of political polarization plus parenting. So these are probably some of the most challenging areas to potentially apply intellectual humility. Our team has decided to tackle these. And so if y'all want to kind of learn more about those, I encourage you to kind of visit our website and kind of explore. And within the next couple of years, we'll have talks, describing what happened with these projects, but should be interesting. So I wanted to end just with a few thoughts as I'm kind of trying to integrate how to think about what would it mean to really grow in humility. So at one point, I was reading Seligman's book on hope, and he mentioned that an analogy by Freud of a man losing his watch and deciding that he was only going to look for it where he could see under the light, of a street lamp. And I think there's something similar to that going on with humility and potentially how is it that we relate to religion and people's views about what's really good in life and kind of their normative views about what it means to be a good person. I think it kind of pushes us to the limit of what psychologists can measure, because there's part of humility that involves someone's deepest sense of the kind of person that they want to be. And so I think that might be part of what's going on with the measurement issues. So I was part of a project where journalists were trying to write stories about humility. They did not like intellectual humility as a term. So just FYI, the term itself can come across as esoteric and condescending to some people. That's at least what journalist reaction was. So I thought that was kind of interesting. We may need to, in interventions, think about how to align our language about humility with people's aspirations of the kind of person that they want to be. In terms of the Moon and Sandage critique, I might kind of land my plane, but this is the critique that I've wrestled with the most, is what does it mean for a community to try to move from a type of humility that's just essentially what kind of person do I want to be, to a shared view of humility? Because part of what I'm thinking, a response to, I'll kind of skip ahead to the quote by C.S. Lewis. He mentions a starting place is to admit that you might not be humble. I think hard to disagree with that. Hard to make progress if you don't think you have room to make progress. But I kind of wonder if humility is a public good. So it's basically something that I can't have unless we have it. So if I want to be a trustworthy person, I need someone else to find me trustworthy. I think humility might be like that. And so I think there might be aspects of kind of trying to do certain virtues alone that may require us to think about what does this mean to do this together. And it may require us to talk about how we solve problems similar to what I described with Josh and kind of the golf clubs. I think I'll kind of end here. So I guess a question that I'm asking myself is, what does it look like to have incremental steps to growing in humility? And so I kind of thought of the pyramids, like a brick is kind of small, but if you stack enough bricks on top of each other, you can make something that's pretty great. The reason why I was kind of thinking this way is, in our work on cultural humility, some people have critiqued it and said, well, why are we just focusing on clinicians doing work with clients? Or why do we focus on how a religious leader relates to one of their parishioners? We need to change the whole system. Well, I agree. The system does need to change for the better. Our problem is we don't agree on how it should change and what it would mean if it was better. And so just kind of very practically, where I'm coming from is I did kind of a Gemini search. How many sessions of therapy happen in a year? And I don't actually know if this was accurate, but it basically said there's like 80,000 psychologists, 220 social workers. It didn't know how to estimate how many religious leaders there were. And the number it spit out was, in a year, millions, hundreds of millions of hours. And so I guess, the thought I would leave you with is, if we can, in our relationships with each other and in our communities, if we can discuss what it means to practice humility with each other in a way that addresses the golf club problem, it has the potential to influence how people are spending millions of hours with people who are trying to heal. And so that's my theory of change is, I don't think it's going to work very well to try to impose my view of humility on the entire world. I think we're kind of in a competition over a type of humility that's kind of efficient relationally. So it actually addresses some of these challenges of, how do I care for myself sufficiently? Because it's not good for me to not take care of myself at all, but to create margin in my life so that I'm growing humility in my relationships with other people. And more than that, I'm teaching other people to be humble. So one of Brad Owens's primary findings, one of his coolest findings, is humility is one of the leadership styles that if you model it, other people can join you. So if I'm the kind of leader where I'm in charge and I tell people what to do, then other people can't do that. Basically, my job is to tell, your job is to do. But if we end up showing how to express humility relationally in a way that other people can participate, that has scale. So anyway, I'll kind of stop there, but our lab has been working on ways of what does it look like, not just positive psych, like, 5 minutes a day, what do I do by myself, but what would it look like to build structural humility into our training practices? And so I was a college football player. My mindset around that is think of someone like Nick Saban of Alabama. So he basically not only had a team that was excellent, but all of his coaches were excellent. And so they went on to basically be some of his biggest competitors. And so some of the teams that ended up beating him later on were basically coaches that left him. I think humility might be that kind of thing. Like, what would it be if we worked on competing with each other at learning about humility? So thank you.